Over to you, Anshika.
Great. Hello, everyone. Great to have you all here. I'm Anshika Yadav. I work as a software engineer at Bloomberg, and I've been here for a couple more than 2 years now. I work with the company's buy-side solutions for investment portfolio management, where I help enhance the portfolio manager's everyday regular tasks. So let's begin. And okay, so imagine you could give your software an elixir for immortality, an architecture that helps, evolve, adapt, and scale your software without falling apart. That is what API first system promises. That is what the API first approach to design your system promises. So my agenda today for this session is going to be convey these three things with my audience so that my audience is aware what these three things are and they can sort of have a more informed decision going forward with their systems. So the first one is going to be what exactly is API first, and the next one is why every new system should be API first to begin with. Why should we design it that way to begin with? And the next one will be how can legacy systems be converted to API first. So let's check if I'm going to be preaching to the choir here. How many of you know about the API first approach or design? Very few, okay. And then let's begin. The concept of API first, right? So what exactly is API first? So when we say API first approach to design your software, we mean API is the primary part of your architecture. API is the first thing that you design and specify even before your internal architecture. You treat your API as like a first-class citizen because everything else, your front-end, back-end, your external collaborations, third-party applications, integrations, everything is going to revolve around it. And when I say that, this approach actually invites a shift in mindset because we all know traditionally how the development has always focused on internal architecture. But now, we're inviting you to think of your API as the product. And when I say your API is going to be a product, can anybody here in the audience think of who the consumer of this product will be? I'll give you an example. For example, think of an e-commerce website, let's say Flipkart. And Flipkart has to sell their things, and they need a payment gateway to go through with their payments, right? And then they would like to integrate with something like Razorpay, for example. And both of these entities or companies would expose their functionality using their APIs, right? And APIs for the first entity are going to be a product for the second one, and the developer of the second company would essentially be the consumer for this API product. So that is how I want you to think about it. Okay. So these are two diagrams that I've put together. They're like fairly simple diagrams, but just it's for you to visualize what the difference between traditional monolithic systems and API first model is. So do you see how user interface, business logic, database, everything seems very interrelated and very sort of, tightly coupled. And you can see how each of those entities look very independent of each other and how everybody can just interact with each other through well-defined API calls. So just for the visualization of that. Now, we know a fair bit about what API first approach to designing a software is. Let's talk about what the benefits are. I'm sure a lot of you are thinking forward and might have already thought about some of these. To begin with, the first one is going to be consistency. Now, when you define your API, you put an API contract in place. So you know what the response of your API is going to be, and you know what the API expects you to pass through it to deliver that response to you. So that sort of minimizes any confusion between different teams, and it makes integration smoother. The next one is going to be flexibility. Now, when I say flexibility, APIs sort of allow you to make changes to your front end without being very dependent on your back end. Or let's say it doesn't disrupt any of your functionalities while doing that. And then next is scalability. Now, how easy would it be to sort of add a new feature, or let's say a new service, integration of a new service, when you already have an API contract in place? You know what is expected of you, and you can just easily go through and scale it. And the last and the most important one is longevity. when I say API first approach, the first step for it is to you have a clear and documented interface that can be reused, extended, or modified without disrupting your existing functionality. So think of it as your immortality potion for your software, I would say. And in line with the benefits that we just discussed, the next step is going to be why you should always think of designing your new systems through the API first approach. And I've listed down 4 things here, and I'll go through all of them one by one, but I think the last 2 are going to be very important. So first one is agility in development. So teams, let's say front end, back end, third party integrations and everything, they can work in parallel because the API contract is in place. You know what's expected, and you can just work in parallel to get your services delivered. Decoupling components. So when you treat the API as the main interface, so your backend services, your front-end applications, they can all evolve independently, and it sort of allows for you to make very flexible updates, and you don't break or affect any other entity there. And the most important one, I would say, is integration friendly, because APIs allow your system to easily integrate with external services, new partners, new technology. You might want a payment gateway for your service. You might want third-party authentication. And this is very specifically important in today's fast-evolving world, with the example that I quoted, let's say Flipkart and Razorpay and stuff like that. And the next one is consistency across channels. So when you follow this approach, the same API can be used across different platforms, right? It could be web, it could be IoT devices or mobiles and stuff like that. So it sort of ensures a very consistent experience for your user, and you also reduce redundancy. And this is just a diagram that I put together. And if you see, it's like so effortlessly branching out, because this approach sort of helps you not only scale across platforms, but also through integrations. It enables multiple integrations for you very easily and very quick. And an example that I would want to talk about is Twilio. And this is sort of a company which sort of adopted this approach since its inception. And they were following this approach since they started developing their system and product itself. And a very unique problem that they faced, and they were able to solve because they were using this paradigm, was to how to bring telecommunications across the internet to the market where you have all unknown devices and you are very unsure of the network capabilities that you're looking at. So I think that's one great example, and there are a lot of use cases that you can read about it on the internet. Okay, so we've talked about why new systems should be API first, but we need to know how to engineer those systems to be API first. So I think the 3 main things here are going to be design, mock, and then document. So when I say design, you should design your API, you should lay out your API specification. There are various tools for that, right? There's OpenAPI, Swagger, use them. Define your endpoints, what sort of responses do you expect, your data formats, error handling, stuff like that. And then you move to the next stage, which is mocking those APIs. And I guess we all know about Postman and stuff like that, right? So we could just use them to mock the request and response model if we are following that. And in this sense, like front end, back end, some other third-party application which is looking to integrate with you can sort of come together and evolve and not depend on any other component to be completed first. And the next step, and the most important one, is test-driven development. For your API validation, you always sort of need, for your endpoints, you should always write tests to ensure they are delivering the expected results and the behavior is as expected. And when we document APIs clearly, not just for external users, but for internal teams, for ourselves, it gives us long-term clarity as well. And now this is just a very simple diagram to put into perspective the flow of how an API first project would look like. The first 3 we've already talked about, which is design, mock, and document. And the next one's obviously, that's when we start the development, and then we can also look at the testing of it, both unit and integration, and the last and final, deployment and monitoring. Now, so we have talked about the new systems. Now, what about I have a legacy system and I would want to convert to an API first system? And first of all, what is the challenge with legacy systems? Legacy systems tend to be very monolithic. They'll be very tightly coupled. And sometimes the business logic will always be like, all over the place, spread thin across components. And in that case, it could be very difficult, and you need very careful planning to sort of, incrementally take your software to an API first paradigm. How do we do that? I've listed down 5 steps here. The first one is going to be you need to identify what is the most critical functionality or service that your product is delivering. What is the main value add? What is the selling point of your product, I would say. You identify that first, and then you create an API gateway, which would help you, sort of abstract out your legacy system and side by side start exposing your functionality through APIs. The next one would be gradual refactoring and API exposure. So we do not really want to touch all of the parts of our monolithic system at once because we do not want to disrupt the service that we are delivering, right? So we want to do it gradually. We would start by exposing the most critical services as APIs, and slowly we'll increment towards getting all of it there. The next one would be ensuring backwards compatibility. So versioning is like really important. This is to make sure that your older APIs can still interact with the newer ones and everything is functioning and you just don't black out at once. And the next one and the final one is improve and evolve. So just keep improving as new requirements emerge because there are always going to be new requirements, and evolve incrementally. Now, again, this is a diagram which sort of depicts a gradual shift wherein there's a monolithic legacy system that we have, and we sort of take the incremental migration path and get to the API first system where everything seems so nice and branched out. And we also have the API gateway in between, which sort of helps you abstract down all of the details. And then, obviously, enables multiple integrations. Okay, so a real world example. I'm sure, like, how many of you have heard about the Bezos mandate or the Amazon API mandate? Has anybody heard about it? Okay, if not, it was basically Jeff Bezos one day telling people at Amazon and their teams that, okay, from now on, all of your functionality, all of your data has to be exposed through interfaces first. And then the next one was, all the teams at Amazon, they need to communicate each other using these interfaces. And there should be no backdoors, no other way for you to communicate with the other team. So this actually, changed the way things were built at Amazon. This led the way for monolithic systems to be, started transitioning to API first. And now, in present day, we all know that AWS is like the leader in the cloud computing space. So that was the famous Bezos mandate, and it sort of took Amazon out of from being just an e-commerce company to a gigantic tech platform, and a cloud computing tech platform at that. Great, so we're already at the part where we summarize what we have learned through this small lightning talk, but I would really want somebody from the audience to summarize it for me. Would somebody want to volunteer? Nobody? It's okay. So if not, we'll just quickly summarize what we have learned. I want this to be very concrete, and I just want these 3 things to just like pass through all of your minds. First, what is API first? API first is about actually treating your API as your product and not anything else. And this has to be the cornerstone across which your front end, back end, all the other integrations and everything else will revolve. The other thing is for newer systems, how would you want to go about it, right? So that would be, if you build your newer systems with API first approach, it will help accelerate development. Your development cycles will be much faster. It will ensure scalability for you, and it will also make everything more flexible. And the last and the most relevant point, I guess, for example, if we have a legacy system, we should transition to the API first approach very, very incrementally and carefully. And this will obviously provide us with long-term goals. And yeah, and this won't also disrupt any existing functionality. Great. So a call to action from me to all of you guys is, I would want everybody to consider, designing through an API-first approach to future-proof your systems, ensure scalability and flexibility whenever you start working on your next software project. And I'll actually repeat, imagine you could give your software an elixir for immortality. And an architecture that evolves, adapts, scales without falling apart. That is what API-first approach does for you. So yeah, thank you so much. And if anybody has any questions, we can take some here if we have time, or I'll be around hall 2. Or you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Thank you, Anshika. Thanks for such an insightful talk. So do we have any questions for Anshika?
We still have 15 seconds.
There's one there. Mike. Mike.
Hi Anshika, I work as software engineer at Expedia. My name is Umang. So my question is, even in the API first approach, let's say over the time your service or your software has become kind of legacy system. So I think you talked about some point about the future proofing your applications, but what can be like the things that we need to consider that your even when you have considered API first approach, your system are still becoming kind of legacy systems.
Can somebody actually repeat the question because there's a lot of echo? You
I
can't
couldn't
hear it?
hear. Can you just say the question again a little louder, please?
Yeah, okay, I will reach out to you later.
Okay.
Okay, so my question is, let's say you have built an API first approach legacy system has so
I can't get you. Sorry.
okay. So let's say you have still kept in mind about keeping the API first approach, but over the time of period, your system has become a legacy because of there have been so much development effort in that system. So how do you keep future proofing in mind even when you are considering an API first approach?
So if I understand correctly, you're saying if we are considering API first approach, how that it ensures that your software is future proof.
So you are going with the API first approach, but over the period of time, the systems have become too much. There are so much team are working on it, and
Like
they are
things,
becoming legacy over the time. So it has become a monolithic kind of thing over a long period of time.
so there's a tendency of the monolithic part of it to come back and
Yeah,
stuff like
yeah,
that. I think that's on us. That's like our active, you know, I would say proactiveness for us, for the developers, for the team to not have that happen first of all. And in case that happens, we need to always sort of look at the very, the functionality, the core functionality that we are trying to deliver. Anyways, that always has to be sort of aligned with API first, right? Because that is the point, that is the selling point, that is where all of your other applications, third-party services, vendors, and everybody will integrate with you, right? So that I think falls on us as a responsibility, I would say.
yeah. Okay. So
We can have a longer discussion
yeah,
later
yeah.
as well.
Thank you, Anshika, for answering that question. I'd like to invite our session chair to do the felicitation, please.